So we'll get started now. So what we see this being is a continuation of this series of virtual events that we've been doing that we call $2 Radio. And there's an archive of them on our website, and which is $2radio.com. You just go over to $2 Radio, click there. But there's some conversations with some of the authors that we've published. Hanif Abdurraqib in conversation with Billy Ray Belcourt, whose essay collection, A History of My Brief Body, we just published. So after this conversation, it will be archived there if anyone's interested in sharing this afterwards. But my name's Eric Obenauf, and I'm the editorial director, publisher at $2 Radio. Andrew Downing is the editor of the Columbus Alive. He is joined by Joel Oliphint, associate editor of Columbus Alive and a former freelance journalist for outlets such as BuzzFeed, Pitchfork, Pacific Standard, Spin, and more. And lately, I've been thinking a lot about the importance of local news coverage, especially where we find ourselves now in the era of COVID, with the current civil rights movement, with the rampant bribery, corruption by state politicians in Ohio. And you realize the dependence that we have on local media, but also on national media. And sadly, with media having become so consolidated, the national media isn't necessarily equipped to tackle coronavirus cases, civil unrest in tandem with the government response in city by city basis or state by state basis. And so this moment in particular seems like what local media was built for. And just citing a statistic now, since 2004, 2,000 newspapers across the country have closed, and in the last decade, those remaining newspapers have cut their staff by 45%. And I don't want this to be a discussion where we're like pouring salt on the wounds or rehashing statistics when I understand that this is something that you've both lived through. And what I see this being the impetus for this conversation series is the opportunity for us to sort of flex our collective muscles as a community. For instance, in the wake of George Floyd's murder and the civil unrest and protests with that, calling to defund the police. Defunding the police was not something that I'd ever necessarily considered. It just was something, ingrained in our collective imaginations. You have books as kids, or say like, what could you be when you could grow up? It could be a firefighter, a police officer, a doctor, whatever. And I never thought to think, what defunding the police would actually mean. And so I think with this conversation in particular, I want to start with the sentiment, which is that local media is absolutely necessary. And we see this now more than ever, but it's under threat on a number of fronts by hedge fund investors, lack of advertising revenue, and so just in terms of considering how we might imagine a media service in the future. And that is obviously not a question I expect you two to answer today, unless you do have that answer, which would be pretty sweet. But, I just want to get a sense of perspective from you into how local news reporting happens and the type of stories that you're working on a day-by-day basis. And right now at the Columbus Live, with it just being the two of you, you're doing everything. And I'm sure you don't hear it enough, but in my opinion, you've proven immeasurably valuable to our community when we needed it most. And so thank you for your tireless efforts on that front. So just to kick it off, what do you feel that your roles are as writers and editors in terms of the stories that you cover and the stories that you report on in the community?
I feel like it changes kind of daily, but the biggest thing is just to be kind of reporting on the ground, kind of in this moment, kind of documenting things as they happen. And particularly with Alive, like we're trying to find the stories that might fall through the cracks at a newspaper like the Dispatch. obviously they have far more resources than us, but they can't get to everything. And sometimes they have a different perspective on things than we do. So we kind of fill in some of those gaps in a way, and maybe take a different perspective with our coverage.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting being local news and also being a weekly. There for one, there aren't that many. I mean, I guess we're not technically a weekly, but that's our tradition, right? We used to be weekly, and now we're daily digital. But I think we do try to maintain that personality of an alt weekly, where it's not quite a daily newspaper, and it's also not quite a monthly. So, but I guess in some ways we're trying to do what we've always done, where we get some shorter to mid-range pieces up every day that are just kind of touching on various issues, while at the same time working on some longer, pretty in-depth stories along the way, so that you get a mix of quick hit arts coverage, but also deeper issues going on in the community, news on restaurants, things like that. But again, it should read differently than it does if you saw a similar topic in the Columbus Dispatch. It should feel different, whether that's like a little bit of humor or just if it's a little edgier. It should be local, and it should have its alive personality, which is, I don't know, maybe Andy, you have a better explanation. It's a tough thing to explain, but I feel like we kind of both now know what that is without even describing it.
You could bring a little more personality and swagger to the coverage. And Joel, you sent this afternoon an article in the Ringer by, what's the writer's name?
It was Rob Harvilla.
Yeah, and so he was talking a lot about alt weeklies and humor and personality that you're able to express, that a lot of these newspapers that have been around for 100 years or 200 years aren't able to bring to their coverage. But you guys, in the last couple of months, you've both had what to my mind have been a couple really big stories. Joel with the school bus and the hippie circus performers who were inaccurately targeted by the police department, and then later by conservative politicians like Marco Rubio. And then Andy, you reported on racism in Bexley and racist, sexist, homophobic bullying. What's the process like for how you came to report on these stories, and what goes into a longer piece such as those?
I mean, a lot of time. Part of it is just finding the time kind of around the daily grind of getting 4 or 5 kind of 600 to 800 word pieces up throughout the day. But a lot of it's just finding the right idea, because if you're going to dedicate yourself to a longer piece with a 2-person staff, you need to know that it's going to be worth your time.
Right.
So you need to make sure that kind of in the time that you're spending reporting, that someone else isn't going to break the piece already, that it will still feel fresh, whether it's 2-3 weeks from now. And chipping away then, I mean, like with the Bexley piece, it was like I got 2 interviews early that kind of let me know that I'd be able to see this thing through. And sometimes you hit on an idea and like interviews just don't materialize and fall by the wayside. It's hard to predict sometimes if it's going to come through or not until you're kind of in it.
So is failure a big part of the process when you're working on a longer form piece such as that, where like how many articles just don't transpire compared to those that do?
Sometimes you think you have a great idea and you do 2 or 3 interviews and it just doesn't materialize in the way you thought it might. So part of it, especially now, is just realizing that some stories you hit that point where it's not worth like banging your head against that wall to kind of make it happen. That you have to move on to something else just from a time perspective.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's more difficult now when it's just 2 of us. When we had more people on staff, it was a little easier to kind of poke into this a little bit, poke around, see if this will work. And it's harder to do the poking now if you don't
Right.
know it's gonna pan out. But you still have to. I mean, there's a couple of stories that I'm a few interviews deep on right now that I just don't know if they're gonna. I don't know if it's gonna be anything or not. But that, like the ones you mentioned, I mean, like Andy said he had a couple interviews early on the Bexley racism piece that seemed like it was going to be something.
Yeah.
And with the circus bus story, that was, I mean, those few weeks were just so crazy. It was hard to know, okay, where do we zero in to kind of go deeper on this aspect? And I guess piggybacking on that, we are fortunate that we have a daily newspaper who's covering a lot of this stuff. So, you know, I know in Margaret Sullivan's book, she's talking about news deserts, and we're fortunate in Franklin County that we're not a news desert. We do have a daily newspaper, and even though there's been a lot of cuts there, you know, they covered the protests. So then the question is, how can we cover it a little differently and go in depth on certain aspects? And so Andy like zeroed in on, and it was just like a fluke who did what on these things. Andy zeroed in on a protester or a guy. There was a video that went around, a viral video, and he was accused of being, you know, Antifa rioter,
Yeah.
and you know, none of it
He's a rock star, right?
right. I mean, it's
Yeah.
not. Yeah, and then he got mistaken for like a guy in the National. So it was more like, okay, Andy's doing that one, I'll do the circus bus one, and let's see what happened. And that one again, early on, was like, oh man, I think there's something here.
And piggybacking what you just said too about us being fortunate to have a daily newspaper in town too, in the Ghosting the News book, she does list several cities that no longer have 7-day home delivered print newspapers. And it's basically a circle around Columbus. You know, it's Pittsburgh, Youngstown, Cleveland, Detroit, Ann Arbor, Flint, Grand Rapids, Toledo, which is pretty wild. So you guys have also been able to provide a platform to some really incredible writers too, like Hanif Abdurraqib and Scott Woods. You know, Hanif curated a poetry series for the Alive. He's written about, you know, after school arts programs and other topics. And Scott, you know, I always enjoy reading his column where it's almost like a man about town. And I guess, you know, kind of as editors, how do you go about building up this local network of voices and soliciting work, I guess?
I mean, with someone like Hanif, it's kind of like a no-brainer. If he's willing to contribute, like, you always welcome something like that. Same with Scott. You know, Scott is someone I've just followed on Facebook for years and enjoyed what he wrote and his takes on things. And so we had kind of an opening for a columnist, and just kind of reach out and say, like, hey, would you be interested in this? And, you know, he kind of says, well, what are the parameters? And I said, write about things that interest you. You know, a lot of it's just finding unique voices and trusting them to fill that space. You know, there's a lot of trust. I trust these people. That's why I ask them to contribute.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we both recognize that it's especially important too that the fact that it is just the two of us, that we do need. I mean, we need more voices. And it's a challenge because we don't have a huge budget, and it's also like it takes a while to cultivate writers, a roster of freelancers. But you know, we know that it shouldn't just be, you know, two white dudes in their 40s every day. We need more. We need more people, more voices.
Yeah.
Early 40s.
Early
Yeah. Almost 40. I got 1 year left. I'm basically 40.
So in terms of like the cultural aspect and the arts reporting, you know, in the Ghost in the News book, she does talk about this as sort of like local media as the village square, where we can sort of like talk about, you know, a local author who's published a new book, or you know, a local band releasing a new album, or a band passing through town, or a new art exhibit going up. How do you see that community impact through your arts coverage? And is it harder to do now, I guess, like in the face of everything that's happening?
for us, it was kind of the driver for a lot of what we did, like prior to COVID. It was a pretty hard pivot once the coronavirus kind of shut everything down. There's kind of that stretch of, you rely on concert previews, music previews, like that's a lot of your kind of edit hole for the week. And when all that goes away, it's kind of like, what do we write about now? Like we're a arts and entertainment publication, and there's no art and no entertainment happening. So
Right.
what are we now? And I thought we pivoted pretty quickly and kind of found our way forward, and just kept finding interesting stories. Like that's the thing. Like there's always something going on, even when it feels like there's not.
Right. I mean, the fact that these venues couldn't put on concerts, that these galleries had to close their doors, I mean, there's plenty to write about there, just about the struggle and how they're doing, and how they're doing like mentally, emotionally, how they're doing financially, what are the plans moving forward. And then this sort of ongoing conversation that every business owner, but also artists are having, like, what is safe? When is it safe to do these different things? And there's all these voices saying different things, and you can, you can get a lot of bad publicity if it's seen as that you're not being safe, that you open too early, but also you want to pay your employees. So that we've been talking to so many people going through those struggles, and I think just laying that out and illuminating that for people is helpful and instructive, and I think shows readers these are the type of issues that that people are dealing with right now when they're trying to figure out what in the world to do with their restaurant or their concert venue or their art gallery.
Right. So then in terms of talking about sort of like media as media and accountability for public officials, the Dispatch has reporting on investigations this week into questionable social media posts of the deputy police chief. You also see it in the case of Ohio House Speaker Larry Householder, and then with the Jeffrey Epstein case too. Where like a lot of people I think like assumed that case was all said and done for, and it was the result of local media reporting in South Florida that really made that case see the light of day. And just to quote from a PEN America report, which PEN America, being a group devoted to free and public speech, the report says, as local journalism declines, government officials conduct themselves with less integrity, efficiency, and effectiveness, and corporate malfeasance goes unchecked. With the loss of local news, citizens are less likely to vote, less politically informed, and less likely to run for office. So you both, in speaking about the media and your role, like how do you see accountability fitting into the equation?
I mean, it's essential, and it's a lot of the work that happens on that end isn't very sexy. I mean, like the householder stuff. I mean, it's a journalist going through document after document, and it takes time and resources. And like Joel mentioned, we're fortunate that we have a paper in the Dispatch that has those resources to commit that time to do that kind of reporting. And as you lose that accountability factor in a big way.
Yeah, and I think it's important to think too about smaller communities. I mean, Householder and that whole and First Energy, that's obviously going to make big headlines. That's big news. Epstein's big news. But there's these smaller communities that used to have small papers that would make sure a reporter was always going to the council meetings, the board meetings, and when no one's there to watch or to listen, there's stories that are there. You just know there's people getting away with stuff, and so there's stories that aren't being written, that even if they were written, wouldn't be national news. But for that town and for the people who live in that town, it's important, and sometimes it's their livelihood. So yeah, I think it's crucial, not just in a city like Columbus, but when you look in rural Ohio and other smaller communities around the country, I think, and they're usually the first to lose their newspapers. So I think it is crucial.
Yeah. I mean, how do you feel? Because the Dispatch, which we're lucky to still have them in town and publishing and everything like that. But that paper has just been shrinking too, year after year, and which I do think is reflective of the larger national trend, I guess, with like print media. In terms of thinking about that, I mean, do you feel that, with all the buyouts and layoffs in media, and closures and consolidations, I mean, do you think that it sort of like enabled this moment where it definitely feels like a society where things are feeling like a powder keg, where you have a police department polarizing issues, politicians taking bribes, the mayor encouraging people to not report police brutality, where, I mean, do you think that maybe leads to some sense, in terms of politics and police departments, where they feel as though like there's less oversight of them, where they can be more lax in their response or not care whether they correct a social media post or something like that?
I mean,
Or do you think they just don't care in general and it just doesn't matter?
I think that the environment helps with that. I think that also just kind of like this narrative, which has obviously come from Trump and preceded him. You talk about fake news or like undercutting like media accountability. It makes it easier to write off, even genuine reporting if it's not something favorable to you. So I think all of that just kind of erodes public trust in journalism, which then makes it easier for government agents, police departments to kind of brush away even accurate coverage.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a powder keg, like you said, is a good way to describe it. And I think it's all those things. Like Andy said, the environment, it's a weird environment that we're in right now in so many ways. But yeah, since 2016, we've had leaders who are very purposely wanting to and successfully doing so, eroding the public's trust in local news. So we're having this conversation about the importance of local news, but there's a big chunk of the population that doesn't really agree, who doesn't really, I don't think, see it as, or at least the existing papers, as something that is that essential, that it's fake news.
Do you get that sense, because I can definitely see that sort of, by throwing that tag of like fake news being applied to national media. Do you get that sense too with you guys in your work? Do you feel like people are throwing that label at you? Yeah.
I do. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. For sure. No question.
Yeah.
I mean, literally those words, people like, send us emails and comment on Facebook posts, and, if they don't agree with it, it's fake news.
I mean, those words come from the top, but it erodes from the bottom. I mean, we're doing the same thing with the electoral process now. You talk about mail-in voting being fraud. It, that erodes it from the ground up, not from the top down.
Right. And I know, you said you guys are both spring chickens, and and so having been involved in journalism for a while, with transition to being digital only, what's the interaction like with people on social media and through comments and stuff like that, and how much emphasis, how important do you feel that for yourselves personally to interact or engage with people on social media?
I'll let you take that,
Not
Andy.
at all. Yeah.
I mean, you don't want to, a lot of people will be like, don't read the comments, which is, I don't agree with that. I think that you do need to read the comments and you need to absorb that criticism and always work to be better. But at the same time, you can't take it personally. And we're fortunate that being kind of an alt weekly, that we can be a little more flippant at times and have a little fun with the commenters, especially on Facebook. So we don't have to be, I don't know, quite as serious with it, which makes it easier to deal with sometimes.
I could tell you were pretty proud of the Larry Householders Unmasked.
Yeah.
That was pretty funny.
Yeah, I feel like we do kind of use that space to joke around a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess, I don't know, interaction on some level is good, but again, like it's not like we have a social media person who's handling all of our social media. It's just stuff that we get to in between editing and posting and writing all these stories. So, in terms of what you're going to prioritize for the day or for the week, it's not interacting with or trying to appease every commenter who's angry about something.
Right. So was it 2015 when Gatehouse Media bought the Dispatch Media Group? I mean, she does talk in Ghosting the News about hedge funds purchasing news outlets, and she describes it as sort of like a harvesting strategy, where they're essentially stripping the car and selling the parts. I mean, how in the last decade have you seen reporting or the media change? And do you approach it differently than you did 10 years ago?
I mean, I don't approach like my day-to-day job any differently. It's still trying to like find and tell the best stories that I can. But you definitely run into some of that, I don't know, kind of that talk you hear across, different companies, businesses, whatever, that do more with less. Like we have fewer editorial staffers, fewer resources, but we're expected to kind of do about what we did before. And at a certain point, you realize like you can't do more with less. You can just do the best you can with the resources you have, and try to kind of create something valuable and that hopefully still benefits the community in some way. So I think that's what we try to do with the site, with the two of us.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's terrible that hedge funds have bought all these papers. I think it stinks. I'm grateful that we still have papers that are alive. I'm grateful that, the Dispatch is here, and as of today, Homeless Alive is still here. But I think it stinks that the ownership of journalism outlets are reporting to shareholders, and we're supposed to get excited when they buy a new mud run or something. It's like I don't care about I don't care what you guys are doing on a corporate level with these various events. Like, we're trying to do the best journalism that we can. And I guess if buying some sort of hot chocolate run will enable us to stay employed so we can keep doing journalism, then cool. But I think in general it's a bad thing, and I think local ownership is preferred.
Well, I should say too, it's not limited obviously to just like media outlets too that are being bought up by hedge funds. And, as a publishing company too, our distributor was owned by a hedge fund for 10 years through the recession in 2008 up until 2016, 2017, which made publishing seem like a really precarious industry to be in, just as an independent publisher, where you have almost all of the reputable independent publishers all existing under this hedge fund's umbrella, and with them essentially like applying this harvesting strategy to different industries. just the general concern about what that means for people and their livelihood. And you realize so much of it's just out of your control.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think
generally we just kind of block everything else out and focus
right.
on
I'm sorry for bringing it up.
Oh no.
Yeah, no, but I think that's what we. Yeah, that's what we're trying. I mean, we know that is our current existence, but we don't wake up every day saying like, "Oh, what can we do for Gannett today?" It's every day like, how can we make Columbus Alive the best possible thing that we can with the two of us, and we'll just keep doing that.
Right.
And what they do at a corporate level is just, it's up to them. I don't we have zero control over it.
Seems like a very healthy outlook. The something else that happened in the recent past too, in 2008, everyone was talking about the death of print, and that was something that obviously affected us too as a book publishing company at $2 Radio. And I remember everyone was all excited about ebooks and digital publishing, and they were talking in 2008. The stat was that by 2018 it would be a 50-50 split between print and digital. And 2018 comes along, it's not even close. Like it's still like 95% print versus digital. And I think that newspapers and media and stuff, it's maybe gone a different direction for print media, where the Alive is digital only. And it seems like a lot of trouble is with Facebook and Google, where media outlets had hoped that some of that advertising revenue would transfer from print onto the digital platforms. But Facebook and Google, where they're not generating the content, but they're still accepting all the ad revenue that they get for their services. But just where do you see media going in the future? I know that, like I said, I do think it's a very healthy outlook that you guys are focused on the day-to-day and just making the stories that you cover the best that they can be. But, if you just were able to kind of imagine what could happen next for media, like what's sort of like best case scenario?
I mean, you can look at some models that seem to be working, like the nonprofit model, like ProPublica. I mean, I think they do some of the best journalism around today. And I do think at some point, I don't know how it would happen, particularly under this government, but I think you're going to have to look at some kind of government funding for newspapers, just kind of embracing it as a public trust again, just to keep it viable.
Do you think that will then erode any of the accountability that happens? I mean, obviously thinking worst case scenario, Donald Trump, like him, saying like, publish positive stories about me if it's government funded, then
there'd obviously have to be like layers of, layers between officials and the journalists to prevent that kind of thing. But I just don't know the subscription model that we're on now is sustainable. Like you said, every year the staff shrink, like paper gets smaller, they disappear. I just think you have to look a little more creatively at how these can continue to exist, particularly in communities that maybe they can't be supported financially any other way.
Yeah, I would love to see, if before governments get involved, if we can make it work with like nonprofits and universities and things like that. I feel like that's possible. We'll see how much goodwill there is, and if there's enough financial backing to that goodwill to have enough nonprofits to fund various news organizations. But it's happening on a smaller scale already, where you have, and it sometimes backfires. Pacific Standard is one example where they were doing really good work, and kind of on a whim, the main financial backer was like, I think I'm done with this. And then all of a sudden the publication doesn't exist. And so that's a danger. But I think there's a lot of, if you can make the nonprofit model work, there could be a lot of good things. I think maybe you have, rather than these one or two large journalism institutions in a town, you have smaller, more nimble outfits that are nonprofit based, that are kind of each doing their own little niche. I don't know. I think it's possible.
Yeah. Or the other option is like like with the Washington Post and the LA Times, you just have a billionaire.
Yeah, right.
That papers.
Yeah, I don't know if there's enough
That
billionaires.
could backfire, like you see in Las Vegas, where Sheldon bought that paper and then just tilted the coverage to favor the casinos that he owns. So.
And so someone did write in with a question that kind of ties to that point. So the question is, thinking of the importance of local ownership, have you seen local business or sponsor influence the reporting or publishing of a story?
Never anything that we've run. I'm very particular about that. Like, no one would influence me beyond like the editorial decision of like, is this newsworthy? We've had, blowback from businesses or whatnot on pieces before, but it never factors into the editorial decision.
Yeah, we don't do that.
Yeah.
There's certainly businesses, like Andy said, who have been upset or who want to influence in a certain way, but Andy and I are pretty on the same page, and as is our publisher, saying absolutely we would not let a local business sway us in terms of our coverage.
Mm-hmm. So another question I had, and it's really the last one I have for you guys, which is just how can we as readers and members of the community support the news media? Does that mean just going to the live website and just clicking all the ads?
I mean, I don't really care if you click.
I'm scared of that rabbit hole.
I mean, visit the website, like share the articles if you find them valuable. They do pay attention to hits, so like, the more traffic we get, the better it does.
Does it matter where you're sharing? Like, if you share, is it better to not share on Facebook versus other venues, or
you generate more traffic with a share on Facebook than you do on Twitter, for example? Like Twitter, like you send out a link, it can be retweeted, 1,200 times, and it'll generate 36 clicks or something. Like Facebook, if you put up a post, you can, on your own personal page, you may generate that same number of clicks. It's pretty wild, the difference between those two platforms. So yeah, Facebook shares definitely generate more traffic for us than any other social media platform.
Yeah, I think Twitter's good for like awareness. People hear about stories. I don't think they read them very often from Twitter. They seem to engage with them more on Facebook, although, all of a sudden Facebook will change their algorithm and then nobody's seeing the posts for a week or two. But yeah, if you like a story, send it around, tell people about it, read the whole thing. So many of our commenters, you can tell they either didn't read it at all, only read like the Facebook summary, and they'll say, well, what about this? And it's like, oh, that's addressed in like the fourth paragraph, if you actually would read it. But it's we have the metrics are important. I mean, they look at things like how much time do readers spend on the page, how many different articles are they reading per session, how many unique visitors, all that stuff. It's weird that we're digital only and that those are kind of our metrics now, but that's what they are now. So as much as people can read if you think it's interesting, and share it with your friends if you think they'll also find it interesting.
Right on.
And for other publications, like, subscribe if you can afford it. If there's a subscription model to a paper like the Dispatch or other local outlets, I do think it's important to subscribe to those things. That's the model we currently have. And while it's probably not going to last forever, it's what we got right now.
So in terms of, what we refer to in publishing as the backlist, like books that we've published historically that might be overlooked or something like that, that didn't generate the clicks. Like for you guys, what's a piece by each of you guys that you're especially proud of that you hope people will check out, or that you'd love to have people check out? And I guess it doesn't have to be something that you personally wrote, like maybe an article that you published or edited.
Yeah, I mean, this is a slightly older piece. It's like 2-3 years back now, but Joel did this piece on Dale Johnston that I think is incredible, and it was one of those where it pops up every now and again via kind of like the true crime world. But if you haven't read that piece, that's one I would go back and revisit of his.
Do you remember what the title is?
What was it called? Just Dale. I mean, we didn't have like a snappy title, I don't think. I mean, it didn't do great online. I mean, it does every once in a while when people like Google his name. But the photo is just this very old man, and the title was something about Dale Johnston. Do you remember what it was, Andy? The headline?
No, it was like one of those like trial of, or it
Yeah.
wasn't very like snap, but it's one of those stories that just has kind of stuck with me. There are a few.
So his name was Dale Johnston.
Yeah, and it's like it would take me 5 minutes to like summarize, which is probably why the story didn't do great online. It's hard to like sum it up in a snappy way. There's all these twists and turns. But basically, he went to death row for a crime he didn't commit, and then once he eventually got released, they refused to give him any money for his time in prison. So, and it was just kind of the fallout. My story is more about like, okay, well, what was the fallout around him for that story?
Like just how his wife, like what happened to her life after he was locked up, falsely accused. It's pretty harrowing, but it's one of those that I always kind of point out to people, because like you said, those kind of like hidden gems. It's that piece that didn't do big traffic then, but it comes up every now and again. It's definitely worth reading.
Yeah, and the folks who are no longer, like Erica is now at the Dispatch, and she wrote some really great pieces. I mean, if you just search for like Erica Thompson, Columbus Alive, you can find some of her cover stories that, which is just like a side note. Some of the cool thing has been, and Andy put together a post on this, once all these protests hit and they're talking about these different issues, these are all issues that we've covered in the past few years, thanks to like Andy's vision and a lot of Erica's reporting. So like the names on the signs are not new to Columbus Alive, and we could say, hey, here's some background on this person. Here's some background on this issue. We reported it on Confederate statues, a few years ago. Erica wrote a story about that, and that's been I don't know if gratifying is the right word, because the issues are tough, and it's a shame that a lot of them are still issues, but gratifying in the sense of like, here we can provide this public service. The fact that this is in the current conversation right now, here's some touch points for you to go back and look at the ways that we've already covered some of this stuff.
Yeah, it also allowed us to bring a little more context to even just like the protests that are going on now, because absent that local coverage, you might think that people are out there simply because of George Floyd, where in Columbus, the activists have been out there for years, and so even now they're out there for Henry Green, for Tyree King, for Jerron Thomas, for Julius Tate Jr., and we've written about all of these people.
And there's another question for you, which comes from Bela. He says, so much of what you both write about is the underserved population. Do you think one of your primary roles as a weekly is to give voice to these underserved populations more than being, quote, an entertainment paper?
Yes. Yeah. It's a huge part of what we do.
Yeah, I don't think Andy and I, neither of us ever want to be just an entertainment paper. I mean, that was never like the goal or vision for Alive since I've been there, and I know not since Andy took the reins. We want to be able to get, and the cool thing is Andy's had this great vision where we can you can tackle the arts and talk about underserved populations or political issues, various issues, through the lens of the arts, and do it in a meaningful way. But yeah, we don't want to just like talk about like the best way to make a mojito or something. That's not interesting to us.
Although useful in the era of COVID.
True.
So one of the articles that you just sent through, Joel, this afternoon at the Ringer, it's by Rob Harvilla about alt weeklies, and touches on both of your response to that question. And just to say, it's a really great article, and you guys should check it out. And let me see what the title is. Alt weeklies face total annihilation, but they're thriving in the chaos. Do you think that that's appropriate? Appropriate description of what's going on with you guys?
Thriving's a little strong, but we're
I like to think of it as surviving. Like the fact that we're even here seems like a victory.
yeah.
But hey, if somebody wants to say thriving, then sure, why not? I don't.
More power to them. I'll take it.
Yeah. Do you think the alt weekly tag is still fitting, appropriate for the Alive and what you guys are doing now?
I think so.
I think
because
so.
we have the flexibility to kind of go between like more playful things and kind of longer, serious reported pieces, and it's more an attitude than a publication schedule, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. Alt weekly, just kind of what, circling back to what we were talking about at the very beginning, that alt weekly almost indicates more about like an attitude a little bit than how frequently you're publishing. But yeah, I still think of us that way.
Could that be maybe a positive that came through as a result of going digital only? Is just that you're maybe less tied to rigid deadlines and maybe are a little more liberated in terms of what you cover and when? Or no?
You think it'll be that, but then you also lose some staff members and you find yourself doing more. So like, I don't know that I ever felt like liberated by any change that happened.
Yeah, I probably felt more liberated before, but we have like the daily email newsletters, the monkey on our back every 24 hours to get that out, which can make it a little tough to get to all the other things. But we're surviving. Some might say thriving.
Okay, well, thanks so much for taking time, guys. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but really appreciate you guys having this conversation with us. And so the takeaway is to read the Alive articles, share them, more so on Facebook than on Twitter. Click on all the ads, and but thanks again. And like I said, I've really valued the coverage you guys have been providing, not just in the last couple of months, but in the last couple of years. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for this conversation, man. Really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, Eric. Thanks.
Yeah. All right, guys. Take care.
All right. See ya.